Hey guys, we are back in our series on First Peter this week. We're going to be in chapter 2, verse 13 through chapter 3, verse 7. And the main point I'll be making in my lesson is to try to push back against this somewhat human and particularly American idea that we should always fight for fairness and for justice. Certainly, that's sometimes a good thing, sometimes a biblical thing, that God is a God of justice. He values justice and fairness and would sometimes call us to fight for that, but that's not always the case. In fact, here in this section, Peter calls us to follow the example of Christ, enduring and accepting unjust and unfair suffering at the crucifixion, and to use that as a model for our life. That there are times when we ought to, instead of fighting back against injustices and unfairness, we should accept it and endure it. And I think naturally we lean towards the fight for justice side, and so I'm hoping to push back against that and show that there are times certainly when God would call us to allow ourselves to be treated unjustly instead of fighting back for fairness. So that'll be the main thrust of what we talk about. You're going to open up with questions, comments, any disagreements, anything people want clarification on. It could be it's a big picture lesson, so there could be some good stuff in that opening question. So make sure you go through that and see if students have stuff they want to clear up or ask. And then you've got not as many questions as usual, but some more in-depth questions, or at least some more explaining that you'll have to do than maybe we typically do on a week in and week out basis. The second question is, can you think of any other principles that might help us determine when we should accept suffering versus when we should fight for justice? So I'll talk about that in my lesson, that there's these kind of two paths. Sometimes we ought to fight for justice. Sometimes we ought to accept unfair suffering. And the hard part is determining when we should do one or the other. And I'll pull out two principles that I think are there in our passage today, but acknowledge that there are more, and we don't have time to exhaust all of those principles. The two that I will focus on is that Peter seems to be focused on calling Christians to, at least in the context in which he's talking, he's calling Christians to accept unjust treatment from unbelievers. And so I'll talk about how we should be slower to fight back against injustices from unbelievers, and quicker to do so when it's the case with believers who should be accepting the same standard that we are, who should be seeking justice and fairness just like we are. And then the second one I'll draw out is that our desire to represent Christ well should take precedent over our desire to be treated fairly. That seems to be, again, Peter's main thrust in this passage, that his goal is that his readers would submit to unjust suffering from the government, slaves to masters, wives from unbelieving husbands, in order that those who would criticize Christianity for the way they relate to the government, their mouths would be stopped, that a slave would submit to unjust suffering from their master, mindful of God, thinking about how I can best represent who he is, and that wives would submit to unjust treatment from unbelieving husbands in order that they might win over their husbands for Christ. So those are the two principles I'll focus on, but I think there are more. That's a big question. Throw it out there in general, give students some time to think, and I think they'll probably naturally start throwing things out, things that can help us determine which side of this path we should go down. And some of them are just going to stem from kind of their natural instincts. And you're going to want to try to make sure any principle you advocate for is tied to Scripture. Not just that it sounds good, it sounds right, it feels right, but it's actually connected to something that God has called us to do in His Word. Now I've given you a couple examples of maybe some more things outside of this passage that you could use to try to help guide that decision. I'm sure there are more that you can probably think of as well, so feel free to bring those up if you have them. The third question is, just asking students to respond to this statement that it's not the job of Christians to bring heaven down to earth. I think everyone will agree with that, but what that actually implies and means for us and how that relates to kind of what we're talking about today is important. That's obviously true. We're not going to bring heaven down to earth. This earth is going to continue to decay. Jesus calls believers the salt of the earth. So he gives us a lot easier of a job. He doesn't say we need to bring heaven down to earth. He says we're salt. We need to preserve the earth, slow down that moral decay. So there is a role in which we should try to slow down this degrading morality within the world, but it's not our job to bring down perfect justice and fairness. And we're never going to be able to do that. And sometimes Christians can get so wrapped up in doing that, in making the earth as fair and as just as possible, that we lose focus on a more important task that we've been given, to not bring heaven down to earth, but bring people with us to heaven. We can be too focused on social justice and alleviating world hunger, these things that we should care about and we should try to do. They're complex topics about how we should do that, how much we should do that. That's going to differ, I think, from Christian to Christian. But we don't want to get so wrapped up in this idea that we want to make the earth as good and healthy and fair of a place as possible that we lose sight of kind of our ultimate goal. Is essentially what you want to bring them through eventually, but allow them to share their thoughts, what they agree with about that statement, what they disagree with. Pause as you kind of go through that explanation to see where they agree, where they disagree. Talk about some of the nuances in there if you want. And then the last two questions are over 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7, which is an address to wives and then to husbands. This is where Peter talks about to wives, don't let your adorning be external. So this is a passage that I think is particularly given the world that we live in, the way that the world views gender and kind of pushes back against any gender stereotyping. We want to explain and handle and not avoid. It doesn't fit perfectly to like go into all these details in our lesson with kind of our main focus, but it's something I want us to cover in discussion groups. So read through that passage. We won't read through the whole thing during the lesson. So have somebody read those verses. And then what you're eventually going to get to is that one commentator sees in these verses two ways that women will try to exercise dominion over their husbands, wives exercising control of their husbands, and then one way that men also try to control and domineer their wives, and kind of how we shouldn't do that. That's really what Peter's instructing, is don't do these things. And what this commentator sees is he's instructing women and men alike not to use these tools in order to control one another. That's where you'll get to in the last question. But first, you want to go and trace this battle for control, to Genesis chapter 3. There's this battle for control in marriage. It traces back to the fall. Throw that out initially, see if your students know what you're talking about. If not, go back and read Genesis 3:16. This is God's curse to Eve because of her disobedience. He tells her that your desire shall be for your husband, but he shall rule over you. And this is a curse directed to Eve, but it really has negative ramifications for both husbands and wives. What God is saying here, though it's a strange phrase, is that women, because of the fall, wives will desire to rule over their husbands, and husbands will then respond to that by ruling over their wives. Both of those are negative. The husband is meant to lead the wife, not to rule over the wife. And the wife is meant to submit to the leadership of the husband. And all of that gets messed up in the fall. The woman desires, instead of being led by her husband, to rule over her husband. And the husbands also negatively respond to that from their wives by ruling over them instead of leading them, which are different things. So this is where this all originates, back in Genesis 3. And there are things for both sides to work on that are also addressed in 1 Peter 3. So then, last question, you'll go back to, can you spot these ways that women might be tempted to rule over and control their husbands, and husbands might be tempted to control or rule over their wives? The two ways I think he sees women or wives attempting to control their husband is in their appearance, is the clearest one, but also with sharp, harsh words. Those are both in there. He encourages them to not let their adorning be external, wives to not let their adorning be external, and he also tells them to have a gentle, peaceful, quiet spirit. Both of these things, this commentator, and I agree with him, he says these are temptations. Women can use these things to try to exercise dominion and control over their husband, and you should resist that temptation. So women have kind of these tools in their tool belt. Guys cannot wink their eyes necessarily at their wives, quite like wives can do to their husbands, and get what they want. Sometimes women can control men with their appearances much more than men can control women with their appearance. And though women, like we'll see in the admonition to husbands, may not be as strong typically as men, as their husbands, they can use sharp, harsh words that can beat down their husbands and put them in a position of authority and hierarchy over their husband. And Peter says, avoid doing both of these things. And then he moves on to the men, and you have this controversial but not really all that controversial phrase that men should live with their wives, husbands should live with their wives in an understanding way, understanding that the woman is the weaker vessel. I feel like we immediately recoil at that phrase, although most, if not everybody, would agree that that's generally true. These are generalities that Scripture explains. Generally, men are stronger than women. And so there's a temptation in husbands to use their strength, their intimidation, to rule over their wives. And this is something Peter says you should not use. It traces back to Genesis 3. You should avoid succumbing to this temptation. So that's a lot of explaining. Hopefully you have time to do all of that. Hopefully your students will understand some of that. Don't be super stressed if you don't get through all of it. But I think in general, if you do get through all of it, it's useful for both looking at yourself and also as our students start dating and pursuing a potential spouse. This means obviously the direct instruction is don't be so focused on your outward beauty, women, wives, and be careful with your words. Don't try to weaponize them to control your future husband. And guys, don't lean so much on your strength in order to gain respect. Lead your wife in an understanding way that she'll want to follow you. And then it also means for husbands, that doesn't mean you can't, or for guys, it doesn't mean you can't marry a pretty woman or somebody that's eloquent and speaks really well in a wife. And for women, wives, it doesn't mean you can't marry a husband who's physically strong or way stronger than you, but you want to avoid a guy that uses his strength and leans on that in order to get respect and to use authority. So that's discussion groups for this week. Let me know if you have any questions. Do some reading through these passages, obviously ahead of time, so you have a good grip on them in order to help walk students through this. So I'll see you guys on Sunday.